Hey guys, James here from jameszproductions. This week, I want to give you 5 tips that can potentially help you make better mixes. These tips are things that helped me a lot during my mixing career, and I hope they'll help you make better mixes as well. Let's get it. The first tip I'll give you is the one that always makes the most difference in my mixes, which is frequently compare the mix you're working on to commercial mixes you love. Emphasis on frequently. This is also called referencing. It is extremely dangerous to be mixing a song for a period of time without comparing it to mixes that you admire. This is because without any point of reference, you will lose the ability to judge various aspects of your mix. You may think the cymbals are bright enough, but they could be way darker in comparison to your reference mixes. You may think there's enough low end in the mix, but your mix actually sounds a bit hollow compared to a commercial mix you love. Or you may think your mix sounds huge, but it turns out to sound pretty two-dimensional compared to your reference mixes. If all we are listening is the mix we are working on, we can easily go down the wrong path without realizing it. The earlier and the more frequently you reference, the more likely your mix will turn out the way you intended to. If you are a beginner, reference frequently is the fastest way to create mixes that sound somewhat pro. If you have a mix that you're working on right now and you haven't compared it to other mixes, do it now. You may be surprised. When referencing, it's extremely important to make sure to level match, which means you need to make sure that you adjust the volume of the reference tracks so they are as loud as your mix. Otherwise, the louder mix will inevitably sound better, which will skew your judgment. The easiest way to compare your mix to other mixes is to use the plugin Metric AB. You can load audio files on it, and it can match the loudness of your reference mixes to the mix you're working on. And then, you can easily flip between your mix and your reference mixes with no gap in between, so you can really hear the differences. This plugin often goes on sale for $29.99, and it's way more useful than those analog EQ plugins and compressor plugins. The second tip I'll give you is avoid mixing individual elements in solo. Now, of course, there are times when you need to solo a track when you're mixing, but for the most part, I would advise against using the solo button too often. The reason is very simple. Your listeners will not hear the individual tracks in solo. This is the reason why I'm a huge advocate for getting the guitar tone, the bass tone, and the drum sound in the mix instead of before mixing. It simply doesn't matter how great a guitar tone or a snare sounds in solo. If it doesn't sound good in the mix, it's not gonna work because the listeners will never hear it in solo. Another reason to avoid mixing in solo is that all the elements in a mix correlate with each other. If you change the bass guitar tone, it's going to affect everything as well. It will change the guitar tone, it may make the kick less audible, the snare could now suddenly sound much thinner, and the vocals could now sound like they're fighting with the bass. If you make changes to a track in solo, you won't know how your changes will affect the rest of the mix, and that's not going to help you create a good mix. So avoid mixing in solo and always mix in context. The third tip I'll give you is do blind tests for the mixing moves you make. I think a lot of us already have the habit of always using the bypass button on the plugin to hear how our settings on the plugin are affecting the audio. But without doing it blindly, it could be just entirely a placebo effect when you think the settings are making the audio sound better or are making any difference at all. This is especially true for analog emulation plugins, saturation plugins, and small EQ moves. Is that tape emulation plugin actually making your mix sound better? Or do you think it is just because it is supposed to? So here's how I do blind tests for my mixing decisions. I first hover my mouse over the bypass button, and then I close my eyes, and then I rapidly click the bypass button many times so I don't know if it's on or off anymore. Now, with my eyes still closed, I play the mix, click the mouse to turn the plugin on and off, and see if I can tell when it's off and when it's on. If I can, I open my eyes to confirm. If I pass the blind test, it means that the plugin is doing what I wanted to do and it's not placebo effect. I go through this blind test a few times for very subtle moves, like a subtle saturation or a small EQ boost or cut, just to make sure I'm not doing something that doesn't even make an audible difference. The bottom line is, beware of placebo effect, beware of mixing with your eyes, and always make sure your mixing moves actually achieve what you want them to achieve. The fourth tip I'll give you is mix at a lower volume level and check the mix at different volume levels frequently. If you monitor very loudly during mixing, it's going to mislead your mixing decisions because your mix will sound better than it actually is. This is due to the Fletcher-Munson curve. Basically, at lower listening volumes, the mid-range frequencies will sound more prominent to our ears, while the high frequencies and low frequencies will sound quieter. However, as the listening volume increases, our ears will perceive low frequencies and high frequencies louder and louder. This is like applying a smiley face EQ to what we are hearing, and it's the reason why we all want to crank up the music we love. But this also means that if you mix at high volumes, you're basically mixing with a smiley face EQ applied to the mix, and your mix will most likely only sound good at high volumes, but fall apart when it's not cranked all the way up. In contrast, if you mix your tracks at lower volumes and make them sound good at low volumes, they will also sound good when they are being cranked up because of the smiley face effect. Of course, you should always check your mix at different volume levels as you're mixing to make sure there are no surprises. The last tip I'll give you is always focus on the end result, not the process. I know this tip is less practical but more about the mindset, but it's an extremely powerful mindset, and a lot of mix engineers unfortunately fail at this. Remember, at the end of the day, your audience will only hear and care about the final mix. They only know and care about if the final mix sounds good or bad. If it sounds good at the end, it's good. Nothing can change that. If it sounds bad, it is bad. Nothing can change that either. Just the fact that it's mixed with a whole bunch of expensive analog gear doesn't automatically make it better. That's it. So don't get bogged down by things that your audience won't care. If you need to use samples to make the drum recordings sound good, use them. If you need to use sampled bass to replace shitty bass guitar performance, do it. If there is a rule, break it. Forget about where you're supposed to put the tape emulation plugin. Don't worry about putting too many plugins on a track. If something doesn't need any processing, then don't put a plugin on it for no reason. Start taking advantage of working in a digital realm and experiment with the tools you have. Remember, mix in a box, think outside the box. Once you adopt this result-driven mindset, you'll see huge improvements in your mixing. That's it for this video. Give it a like if you find these tips helpful. Subscribe for awesome music production content every week, and I'll see you next time.